So we're doing part 3 technically of Serum 2 now. And then this part, I'm going to be focusing mostly on these 3 kind of sample-based sort of oscillator types. So it's just regular sampler engine, the granular synthesis, and the spectral synthesis. Right? So all 3 of those sort of are using and manipulating samples. Technically, the oscillators of Serum, every single mode of them, including the wavetable mode, is just sort of using and manipulating samples, because the samples or the wavetables actually in Serum are just sort of audio samples that have been chopped up into individual cycles, right? But these 3 modes are a little bit more kind of, this one is more of a traditional kind of sampler style thing, and then the granular and spectral are more kind of like interesting ways of manipulating samples to generate sound. So we'll talk about those a bit. So right off the bat, when you just have kind of like an initialized preset and you load one of these sampler types up, you basically get nothing because there's no sample loaded into this slot yet, right? So we'll have to pick a sample. We could pick one from the sample library in the computer if we want, or if we go up to this drop-down menu right here, you can choose from a bunch of kind of factory samples, right? Interestingly enough, you can also choose any of the wavetables to load up as a sample in here, right? Which can actually be kind of interesting. So let's like load up, say, this sort of 4088 sample. And what you hear when I play this is it's just sort of like a synth sound that kind of like changes timbre over time a bit, right? And also behaves kind of like a regular sampler, where as you play a higher pitch, it's going to pitch up the sound, which also means it's going to speed up the sound, right? And as you play a lower pitch, pitches down the sound, so speeds or slows down the sound, right? Serum 2 does not have the same type of like sample warping that you're able to do in something like, say, Ableton, in the sampler instruments in Ableton, or like in Ableton's kind of like audio editor, right? So it's more of kind of like a traditional sampler. Let's go ahead and find like a slightly different type of sample. We do like a little flute. Let's do like this flute long vibrato sample or something, right? This is a good example because it's a longer sample and it kind of like changes a lot over time, right? So there are a few different playback types that we can choose for these samples, right? The default one is what's kind of called one shot, where it basically just sort of plays through the entire sample. And then once you get to the end of the sample, it stops, right? That's also affected by the volume envelope though, right? So remember, envelope 1 for Serum, both versions of Serum is always going to default to controlling the kind of main kind of amplifier volume for the sound. So even though it kind of calls it one-shot mode, it's really more like a trigger mode, I would say, right? Where it's not actually just, or not a trigger mode, but it's more of like a gate mode, where it's not actually playing through the whole sample every single time. Then we've got a couple of different types of loops, right? So let's go over to a forward loop, right? And then you notice as soon as you select this forward loop type, you get this loop bracket inside of the sample area, which you can click and kind of drag around. And you can also adjust these two for a loop start position and a short loop end position, right? So I could make the loop kind of the entire length of the sample if I wanted to, and then maybe play a really high note. And it's just going to loop through the whole thing, right? Or if you want to, you can have the loop kind of play through a very specific section of the sample, right? So I go to like here, this kind of like loudest area. Now it's just going to kind of loop only through that section, but it's going to start at the beginning of the sample here, right? So you'll notice that there's these two kind of little arrows and these kind of yellow lines on either side. So I can actually change the start position of the sample with this one, and then like the end position of the sample with this one. Okay. When I've got a loop on, the end position doesn't exactly matter that much. Except for in this last mode, which is tailed. Right, so if I go to tailed, and then maybe I take my release time of this envelope and turn it really long to like, I don't know, 10, 12 seconds or something like that. Interesting about that is not really showing us the kind of like loop start and loop endpoints here, but you'll notice that it's kind of playing back and forth between the last sort of like third, right, of the actual sample length, right? I go back to forward loop. Also have the ability to, I think, make it so it kind of plays through to the end after that there, but I'm not really sure if we can do that just from this menu. Anyway, so one thing to kind of note when you're sort of setting up loops in samplers like this is you do want to usually try to set up a loop so that it kind of sounds, the best way to put it is sort of as realistic as possible, right? Especially if you want to be emulating kind of like more of like a real instrument. And also in order to have kind of like an infinitely long kind of sustain for your sound, you want that loop to be as, I would say, kind of like transparent, or like you don't necessarily want people to be able to hear that it's looping over and over, right? So if I like change this loop to be a lot shorter, you'll kind of hear like that. For the various confused start stuff. So what you can deal with that is by using crossfading, right? So right here, this sort of like X button over here, you can click on this and you can drag to essentially kind of crossfade between the end position of the loop and the kind of start position of the loop, right? And so now when we play a note, we're not hearing that click happen anymore because the crossfade between the start and the end of the loop, it essentially smooths the sound out. Right? It's still not completely transparent, I would say. So you can try doing things like turning the crossfade up even more. You can kind of still hear the loop, right? Or other things that you can do is you can kind of adjust the length and kind of position of the loop itself, right? So if I make this maybe a little bit of a longer loop, and then I put it kind of more around like an area where the sound stays kind of as same as possible, then still kind of present. So what I could do is I could use the scroll wheel on the mouse to kind of scroll in a bit, right? And I could maybe find, okay, I'm going to find a position for this loop where it's going to be sort of as kind of non-obvious as possible. So I'm going to maybe loop a very, very short section. And that's like a little bit more kind of like, I would say it's like a smooth, like endless sustain for that sound, rather than being able to hear like, oh, it's kind of like looping, you know, once it gets to a certain point, right? Next mode that we would have is the reverse loop. So what that's going to do is instead of loop forward from the kind of beginning of the loop position, it's actually going to start looping backwards. So I'm going to extend this to be a little bit longer. Play some notes. So basically it just plays through the sample until the end of the loop bracket and then starts playing backwards through the loop section and just continues to do that, right? Or we have the /reverse where it's going to basically ping pong. Actually, if you notice, the note sort of like a unit position. So it's kind of like playing back and forth between the same section. Right. Yeah. So you can make like a nice kind of like sounding thing. There are a couple of other options over here, right? There's sort of this relative loop option that you can kind of turn on or off. I believe what that's going to do is so when you have the relative loop on, you'll notice that it sort of limits where you can kind of place the start point. Right, so I actually can't take the loop start anywhere earlier than this area right here. And then the loop endpoint, I can make really, really short, or I can sort of extend it past there, right? So what it's doing is it's sort of taking the sort of loop length and position, and it's basing it on the actual length of the sample that you've chosen, right? So if I wanted to change this kind of relative loop to loop in the position where I really want it to, which is above this lattice part, I actually have to go ahead and adjust my start position of my sample, right? So now it starts earlier, but the relative loop is now in that kind of like area of the sample that I wanted to be, right? So the relative loop mode, it's sort of a constraint kind of designed specifically for probably certain types of sounds. So, right, it sort of works best for sounds that don't necessarily have like a super obvious kind of like tail where they kind of like cut off like that, right? Otherwise, you have to like really adjust your start and end positions. And you'll notice that end position doesn't really have any kind of an effect on it until I bump the end position to be, you know, like before the end position of the loop, and then it actually starts bumping the loop end position to match, right? But now you'll notice I can do something really interesting here too, is which I can make the start point of the loop happen before the end position of the loop, right? So if I go back to just the forward loop mode, you'll notice it's behaving like a backwards loop, but it's not a backwards loop, right? It's just that the start position is before the end position, right? So if I were to go to kind of reverse loop now, you'll notice that's going to do something kind of interesting. It's kind of before. We're going back into a loop. It's going to behave the same way, but it's going to, yeah, that actually kind of behaves essentially the same when you have a forward and reverse loop on, if your start position is after your end position, right? So it's kind of an interesting way to kind of like change and kind of like manipulate kind of, you know, when looping is happening. The reason why you would ever sort of like think about doing those things is just because of the fact that you can modulate loop end or loop start with things, right? So you can have these loops actually change shape, right? Over time. Right? best way to do this would actually be to have this be free running, I think. And so this LFO is now going to sort of like choose kind of like a random loop length. So once we get to there, you'll see some of them are kind of longer, some of them you can kind of hear.
Right. The low start.
Yeah, so it adds this sort of like interesting element once you get to the end and you get to this loop point where some, especially if you're playing like a polyphonic patch, like a pad or something like that, your sort of like sustains are going to have, each note is going to have its own little character to it, right? So it adds a lot of interesting motion.
Crazy.
Yeah.
So much to tinker with.
I know, right? So I'll remove the modulator there. Let's go on, Joe.
Pretty good. So I couldn't make it in person today, but
That's all right.
all good.
Turn it up just a tiny bit. Cool. So again, we're kind of talking about kind of the sample mode here. We're mostly talking about sort of like the loops that you can do. So I'll turn relative loop back off, which means that we can now change our loop start position and loop end position to be wherever we want, right? There's also this kind of link loop length option, right? Where now when I adjust the end position, it's actually going to change the length of the loop. And when I adjust the start position, you can see that the length of the loop itself remains the same. It's just the start position is
Okay.
going to be changing. So you can sort of set like a sort of specific length of the loop that you want, and then you can only just adjust this parameter just to adjust where that loop actually happens, right? And then the last option is this exit loop on release, which is one of the ones that I was kind of thinking of, where if we go to say just forward, or well, let's go to forward loop mode, right? And then I'm going to go ahead and have this loop be kind of short and just like be right here at the beginning. And then I'll turn my sustain up or my release time up again. You turn that on. I play some notes. Now when I release these notes, they're going to play through the rest of the sample after the loop. Right. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yep. So it lets you sort of use the natural tail of the sample as the actual natural tail of your sort of release time, instead of having your release just be more of the same loop.
Gotcha.
Right. So that's sort of one of the most ways to get like the most kind of like realistic sort of like acoustic instrument sound out of a sample is to have that kind of like use the tail of the loop as the release instead of use the loop as the release itself. Right. Or sorry, the tail of the sample is your release time.
Yeah.
So I mean, cool. All right. I'm gonna go ahead and turn that off. I'll turn that off for now. And we'll go back to one-shot mode, right? And then we'll turn this kind of crossfade down. You'll notice that like even when you're in one-shot mode, you still have the ability to change your loop start time and your loop end kind of position, right? So reason why I'm going to kind of shorten the sort of same area of the loop right now is the next kind of control that we have for this sort of sampler is this scan tile, right? So this is something that you don't see super often outside of say like granular synthesis, right? But what it is it's essentially a control for the playback speed of playing through the sample. So at a scan rate of 100%, it's essentially kind of playing through this sample at kind of its original speed, but the speed is going to change depending on the note, right? So I play that note. There's kind of like a middle C. That's probably kind of the original pitch for the sample, right? If I reduce this scan rate maybe down to like 50%, also changes the pitch down an octave because we're playing through the sample twice as slow, right? So something that you really need to watch out for, because if you're not doing kind of like even kind of divisions of time, you can actually say if we go up to like 70%, I try to play a C. I'm not gonna play a C, right? So be careful. Yep. You can also go down to 0%, right? How's it going, Logan?
Yo.
Yep. All right. Just talking about the sampler engine for Serum.
Ooh, okay.
So you'll notice something kind of weird is happening. I'm at a scan rate of 0%. Ableton is showing me that like volume is coming out of Serum right now, but like I'm not hearing anything, right? So what's going on, I think, is that the 0% is not necessarily like a true zero. And it's trying to play through that sample so slowly that it's completely like sub audio pitches right now.
Wow.
Right. Now another interesting thing that we can do is we can go into negative scan rates, right? And that actually just means if we go to like minus 50%, we're going to start from the end and we're going to play backwards through the sample, right? We go to a negative scan rate of negative 100%. We just play through the sample backwards at full speed. Right. Which can really be interesting with using kind of like the loop modes too, right? So if we go to like a forward loop when we're playing through the sample backwards, we get some kind of interesting behavior. Turn that crossfade up a bit. You notice that it actually just begins straight from the sort of like end of the loop instead of beginning from the beginning of the sample, right? Or really, it starts from kind of the end of the sample and then it sort of loops through this backwards, essentially.
Oh, that kind of flipped me.
Yeah, kind of flipped it, yeah. So another thing that you can do is you can do that trick where you have your loop start time before your loop end time. Or after your loop end time. And now we got this interesting thing where you play a note, then it basically kind of behaves as like a forward loop while you're basically playing through the sample back. Right? So all of that to say it's a very sort of like kind of complex way of kind of interacting with these samples by sort of starting backwards and having them kind of play forwards again after that. But it's essentially kind of the opposite of, you know, having this be scan 100%. And then we've got a forward loop. Or not really a forward loop, but it's sort of the opposite of having a reverse loop and having it kind of play through the sample forwards initially, right? So you can kind of do the inverse of that. And then of course you can also speed this up beyond 100%, all the way up to 200%, right? Essentially just going to kind of pitch that up by an octave, and then we can go negative 200%, which is playing backwards. Also pitched up by an octave. Right. Crossfade back down. So I'm going to set that scan to just kind of 100%, which is normal playback speed. And then the other thing that you can do with samples is you can still use the same like oscillator detuning and kind of like stacking of voices that each oscillator has, right? So you can turn our unison voices up to maybe like 5 or something, and now have like a unison out version of that loop sample, right? And then we can change the detuning amount. We go between just sort of like a sort of almost kind of like lo-fi sound, sort of like a chorusy sound, to this really super like spread out, almost atonal type of sound, right? And then we also have the controls for the blend amount, which again is the control for the relative volume of the wider detuned voices compared to the voices that are like more centered in the middle, right? So if we have blend all the way to the right, wide detuned voices are going to be louder. So if we have blend all the way to the left, they're still going to be there, but you can tell that the kind of the detuned voices are a lot wider. They're like much less kind of prominent, right? Ooh, and then again, the different sort of like types of detuning. I'll bring that blend back. That we can choose from this kind of like detuned settings menu are available here. So we can go to a different type of detuning mode. Say for instance, maybe like this sort of super mode instead of linear. My kind of like favorite thing to do with this, which I'm going to go ahead and do real quick, is if you were to say grab a different type of sample. Let's get like just a piano, a regular piano sample, and we'll have it start and end kind of normally, right? So with no unison, this piano sample almost kind of sounds like a harpsichord sometimes, which is interesting, but it is sort of a piano recording, right? So when we turn the detune or the unison voices on this up, maybe go to like 5 or 6 voices or something. We get that sort of like detuned kind of like honky tonk piano sound out of it, right? But if we change our mode to something like, say, for instance, random for the unison mode, instead of all of the voices being spaced out kind of evenly from each other, it's going to sort of like put them kind of in a random amount of detune away from each other, right? And that has the effect of usually having a sort of more kind of like lo-fi feeling is the best way to put it, right? Because this
Sounds
detuning,
warmer, I guess.
yeah, and then you can kind of control how much happens with this blend amount, and you can kind of control the randomness with this detune amount over here, right? And so some of the notes are going to be more out of tune than others. And it sort of has this almost effect of like the piano itself has like been poorly tuned, basically, right?
Yeah.
And so it gives you this really sense of kind of like a vintage, like old piano in some kind of like old space, right? That does not sound quite right. I don't know if anybody has heard of a artist called The Caretaker. Oh, man, it's a almost sort of like an ambient project, but guy has made like multiple like 6 or 4 hour long albums that are essentially just old recordings of like jazz tunes that like over time get slowly more and more and more kind of like destroyed and disintegrated and like sounding like they're like being played from like the other side of like a cruise ship or something like that.
Wow.
And like it's like meant to like simulate the experience of like living like further and further into like dementia.
Yeah. Oh man.
It's just like it's really like honestly kind of disturbing,
Whoa.
but it's a really, really super cool kind of like concept and kind of a project.
That's it.
It's done. Yeah.
Man, Serum is crazy.
Yeah, you can do so much with this. Speaking of which, I'm gonna go back to just kind of one voice. It's kind of piano sound. We still have a bunch of kind of warp modes that we can use, right? We don't have the same warp modes that we had for the wavetable oscillators. So we don't have things like the kind of like bend plus and minus or the kind of like repeat map thing. We do have the low pass filter or high pass filter. So if I go with low pass filter for this, you just get kind of a nice basic filter on sort of oscillator level or the sample level. Same thing for that high pass filter, right? And then we also can apply all of the different distortion types that are available in the kind of distortion effects, just like directly here too. Okay. You get that nice kind of like tube sort of saturation, or all the way to the aggressive. Great kind of distortion. And we didn't even have to use kind of like the effect engine, right? We just had to literally apply that here in this oscillator, right? And then we can even do second one where maybe we do like the low pass filter. Right? And so when you're doing something like this, where you've got maybe like one of these warp modes, sort of one of these sort of like oscillator kind of like variation is like a distortion effect, and then another one is maybe like a low pass filter like this. This is where the option to swap warps actually comes into play, right? Because in this case, the distortion is happening first, and then the low pass filter is happening second. And we can go and we can swap them, and now the low pass filter is happening first, and the distortion is happening second. What you'll notice is a completely different sound from this. To offer now. And then the other one, or the other sort of type of kind of warps that we have are these kind of cross modulations between different sound generating things in Serum, right? So there is frequency modulation between different sounds. There is what's called phase distortion, which is a very similar effect to frequency modulation, but it's a little bit less intense, basically, is the best way to put it. You can get more kind of crazy timbres out of FM than you can get out of PD, but they sound pretty similar. Then there's amplitude modulation, which again is taking one sound source and modulating the volume of the other sound source based on the first sound source, right? So it's kind of like, the best way to put it is like a tremolo effect, but it's a really, really fast tremolo effect because it's happening kind of at audio rates, right? And then there's ring modulation, which is kind of similar sounding sometimes to amplitude modulation, but it can get a little bit weirder because you're kind of taking sort of like the sort of sum of two sounds and then sort of like adding the difference of those two sounds kind of together into it. And I'm not explaining that very well, but it's more of taking kind of like the sum of two frequencies, I would say, and then like combining that with the difference between those two frequencies.
Gotcha.
Right, instead of just sort of like volume level, it's sort of more of a frequency level. Right?
Yeah, I think I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Yeah, totally. So what's kind of an interesting thing that we can try doing, for instance, is let's use one of these kind of like modulation types. Maybe let's do amplitude modulation from B. And then usually when you do this, you'll do it with like, say, an oscillator shape, right? So we won't listen to this sine wave. We'll turn the level all the way down. We'll just use the amplitude modulation from that sine wave to like affect this sound, right? If I turn this up, here it's having like kind of an almost distortion-y effect kind of on the timbre of this, right? And where you set the octave of this has a big effect on the timbre of that. So if I turn the octave down, you get much more kind of bassy, kind of like buzzy, kind of lower type of effect. If I turn this octave maybe up one, a little bit kind of brighter, a little bit less kind of easy to hear. If I were to maybe like change the pitch of this by semitones, let's maybe go up to like a fifth or something, we'll get modulation that's maybe like a little bit more atonal, right? It's not quite like kind of on the money. And if I change this to something that's not something that would even sound that great, like maybe like, you know, like a sixth or like a diminished fifth or something like that. Now we're like fully into like very kind of like inharmonic tones being generated by this,
Cool.
right? Yeah. So the amplitude modulation and also the sort of frequency modulation and the ring modulation types really depend on where you set the pitch of your modulating kind of oscillator, right? If I were to switch this from AM to, say, for instance, ring mod from B, we're able to get these like kind of interesting kind of bell-like tones when we have that, right? And it sounds a bit different from if they're sort of exactly the same pitch, right?
Yeah.
If I were to go to like say FM too, that's going to have its own kind of timbre. You hear that the FM is like really nice and bright, especially when you kind of turn the amount up here. But that is all kind of like sort of well and good, and that's sort of more kind of like a traditional, I guess, thing that you can do, although it's kind of non-traditional, right? Because normally when you're doing frequency modulation synthesis or like phase distortion synthesis, you're usually using two kind of like single cycle oscillators and having them modulate each other. In this case, we're having a single cycle oscillator modulate a sample, right? Which is already kind of a newish and interesting way of doing this. But there's no reason that our modulation source can't also be a sample, right?
Here we go.
So let's go ahead and get, let's get something a little bit longer. Let's maybe get like a, we'll do this like flute long stab sound or something like that, right? And now this is our modulation source for frequency modulating this piano sound. Let's take a listen to this. Not too crazy. We turn the amount up. It's been kind of fun, right? Let's maybe play around with changing the octave of this flute sample. It does sound super brassy, right? So we've kind of done this almost like combination of these two sounds in a way that's not just layering them. It's like sort of like having them cross modulate each other so they become something new, which is super fun. Let's go ahead and turn this maybe up an octave from there. And what's interesting really to me about using a sample to like cross modulate another sample in this way is the fact that the samples have this sort of like built-in envelope shape, right? They're not just a static single cycle waveform that's kind of just constant. It is louder at the beginning, right? So that's why we're hearing this like we're hearing that change in timbre over time because the sample that we're using to modulate the other sample is also kind of changing. It's not just the stat thing. And then another thing that we can do, which will probably be interesting, is we can maybe make this kind of like a non-normal kind of semitone. Like let's go like +6 semitones on the modulating sample. And now look at this really wild kind of atonal thing going on, right? If we maybe change this to another modulation type, let's say amplitude modulation.
Seems like with like a sample, it seems to retain more of its like tonality when doing atonal stuff versus using just like oscillators.
It seems to be doing that, yeah.
It's cool.
Yeah. I think
Like best of both of it.
kind of a best of both worlds thing. If we make that semitone value maybe +7, kind of get even less sort of atonal with that. And if we bring that back down to 0, so it's just playing the same pitch. That's with no amplitude modulation from the flute sample. And here's with like maximum amplitude modulation. Right? Yeah. It still kind of has that character of being a piano, but there's just something else kind of on top of there, right? Now, about the sort of set of kind of preset samples that you get, you'll notice that there's this sort of factory, and then there's this factory non-tonal, right? So the non-tonal ones are going to be really interesting for this because they're not necessarily meant to be kind of like a particular pitch, right? There's like drums, there's like loops, there's like noises, there's like sound effects and stuff like that, right? So if I grab maybe like, you know, the digital interference sample, and I use that as a modulation source for my piano. You get these like wild, kind of crazy zap sounds. Like, let's change that to maybe ring modulation instead of amplitude modulation. We get something like that, and then maybe we'll do, say, phase distortion, right? Just to hear. Kind of has to like play through that whole sample before it gets down to actually being like a tonal thing again, right? You change this to something a little bit different, maybe like a drum-like thing. Like let's get like a clap sound or something, right? You hear how there's that sort of additional effect of when I'm adjusting this sort of phase distortion amount, it's kind of changing the pitch a little bit around of the original sample, right? So you can kind of hear that the phase distortion is a way of affecting the pitch of this sound. It's just that we're using this sample to modulate the pitch of that, right? Same thing for FM. If we turn the amount down for these, we can get these like just like slightly sort of shifted and sort of adjusted and like kind of attack texture space for this piano sound, right? We'll turn this clap octave down. It just gets a little bit kind of dirty at the beginning and then kind of plays through its middle, right? So really, really kind of interesting way of thinking about sound design specifically is just taking two samples and not just sort of layering them together, but actually having them modulate each other, right?
Cool stuff.
Yeah, it's really cool stuff. Does anybody have any kind of questions so far about any of this stuff before we kind of move on to the next thing that you can do with this kind of sample engine?
No, I have things I want to try now, but no questions.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just like processing it. It's so many like possibilities with this. It's
Yeah.
insane.
It is wild. And like the wild thing is that we literally are just using two oscillators in Serum, and like the only thing we've adjusted is like the release time, right? And then like one of these knobs. So it's kind of wild. Okay, so the next thing that we should talk about is you'll notice that we have sort of like factory kind of non-tonal options, and then one of those was loops. Like we could get, say, a drum loop, right? I'm gonna go grab this like 1993-98 drum loop. I'm gonna turn the modulation down. The scan is at 100%, so I'm just gonna play like a C3. Play this original pitch. Right. So want to talk about like a couple of options in this right-click menu real quick.
Does this pop up only when you use like non-tonal ones?
It pops up for all of them, but I'm using the non-tonal. I'm using this loop for a specific reason. Yeah. So the right click menu is always there. We have these different snap options that I kind of want to talk about. You can have snapping off, which that means that your start and end points for your sample and also like the start and end points for your loop are just going to be like exactly where you set them. Right. So if I turn the loop on for this, and I set the loop start points maybe like there, and the loop end points like maybe there. And I kind of zoom in on this area. Right. If I go to snap to 0, it's going to make a little tiny bit of an adjustment there. Right. And you'll notice that when I'm adjusting the loop start and end points, as I'm going through these ladder sections, it's kind of stepping through them. So what it's doing is it's finding what are called zero crossing points, right? And it's not letting me put sort of the end of that loop at a spot that is not a zero crossing point. And that's the zero crossing point of the kind of like neutral no volume of the audio wave, right? So if I were to go snap off, I can just put this wherever I want. And if I kind of put it in the middle of that, it might sound a little bad. There might be some kind of clicking in between that loop. Or I could go snap to 0. Then as I move this, I'm gonna have a little bit of a smoother loop because it's sort of actually finding that zero crossing point, right? You can also have it snap to beats, right? And so when I adjust the kind of loop start and end points, let's zoom in a bit. You'll notice that it's actually just snapping to like individual kind of like eighth or kind of probably 16th notes, right, in this audio sample. So it's gone and it's kind of analyzed the length of this, right? So I'm going to go ahead and turn the loop off for a second. We also have the snap to loop function where basically this is an interesting one. If loop is not on, you go to reverse loop. The loop is not going to snap to things because the loop is the kind of source of the kind of like snapping option, but we have sample slicing is the other thing that we can do in here, right? So I'm going to go ahead and turn the snap back off. I'm going to turn the loop back off for a second, just to show y'all. We have automatic slicing and we have kind of manual slicing that we can do, right? So if I go slice auto, what this is going to do now is it's actually going to take this audio loop and it's going to slice it up into kind of individual component parts. And it's actually basing those sort of component parts on like transients that it's detecting, right? So now each key on the keyboard is actually just playing a slice of that sample, right? So if you have a drum loop like this, you can go in and you can essentially make it slice individual notes of that drum loop. There's a sort of line that you can control right here, and this is the sort of automatic like sensitivity threshold, right? So as you turn this down, it's going to detect more and more transients. And as you turn it up, it's going to kind of detect less and less, right? That just means as you turn that up, there's going to be less total slices. As you turn it down, there's kind of going to be more total slices, right? So if it's all the way down there, you can hear that that slice didn't really have anything in it. So maybe I'll bring the threshold down a bit or up a bit. And now all of the slices will kind of have more valuable information in them. Basically, they're sort of sliced to where they need to be, right? I'm going to go ahead and turn the slicing off for a sec. I'm going to zoom all the way back out. So if I go to snap to beats, and then I go to slice automatic, theoretically, all of these slices that it's generated are going to have snapped to an actual kind of like beat division, because Serum is going to have analyzed the length of that audio clip and say, okay, it's probably this many, 16th notes at like this tempo, right? So it's able to kind of detect that, and then theoretically now those slices that it's making are not going to exactly be 100% on the transients all the time. Sometimes they might be more kind of on like the beat of the track, right? And then you'll notice that thing that I should be able to do is if I go to slice manual, I should be able to take these slices and kind of adjust them. But when I'm in slice to beat mode like this, I can only adjust these slices by beats, right? And I can only kind of place them by beats. So if I go to snap off, now I can go in and I can manually add new slices kind of wherever I want, right? Or sort of readjust them. And so I've kind of messed up the slices over there. Kind of moved C2 like all the way this way, right? So go slice off. We could maybe do a snap to kind of zero crossing. And then I could go to maybe manual slice mode. The manual slice mode essentially just gives me the ability to kind of adjust the start and end points of these slices, right? So this one I can move, but now that I'm in that snap to zero crossing mode, the beginning and end of the slice is only going to be at a zero crossing point, right? Versus when snapping is off, I can put that kind of wherever. The one thing that I wish it had, which it does not have, is just a slice this sample into like an even number of slices, which a lot of other samplers do have. It seems to only have the kind of transient detect mode, and then you have to kind of go in manually and adjust those slices yourself, right? Yeah, so if I go to automatic slice, adjust the threshold. It's not like putting a slice like every quarter note or something like that. And when I adjust the threshold, it's still basing my kind of slice points on where the transients are. Even if I turn this off, switch to snap to beats, and then go back to automatic slice mode again. Again, even at the highest resolution, it's still snapping those slices to transients and not actually just dividing it into maybe like, a total of 16 slices or a total of 8 slices or a total of 32 slices or something like that. So what that's really good for in this case, though, is it's good for taking like a loop and then separating out each of the individual kind of hits of that loop. And then you can basically just play the hits of that loop across the keys, right? So you can turn a drum loop into individual drum setups that way that you can kind of play, right? If we were to go into here too, it looks like there is this auto sync to clip. Which I think has more to do with the actual kind of clip editor down here, right? You'll notice that once we sliced everything up, you'll notice that in the clip, there's now all of these notes in here. Whereas normally there would not have been any kind of like added like MIDI notes in a clip. It would have just been a blank clip, right? So all of these MIDI notes now correspond to the different slices, right? That we're able to get from our oscillator.
And the length of the MIDI notes are just like basically like kind of representing the length of the actual hit.
Yeah, the length of those MIDI notes definitely represents the length of the individual slices in there, right? Yeah, so.
If you adjust it in the clip section, would it adjust the slice on the oscillator window?
So if we may make that adjustment right there, let's see what happens when we go back. It looks like it didn't. I think we changed note E1. this note right here, right? So I think it didn't actually move that necessarily. I'm gonna go ahead and try moving it back to kind of where it was. Yeah, so that's kind of, it's still in the same place as the sample. So what happens is when you move these MIDI notes around in the clip and you actually play this clip, it's gonna play these slices in the new pattern that you make, but it's not actually gonna change where the slices are in the sound.
Gotcha.
Right, so you can use the clip to kind of write notes, write patterns in Serum directly in the same way that you could use it to, or in the same way that you could use like a MIDI clip in your DAW, essentially, to send it notes, right? So it just sort of has the kind of like MIDI clips built into it now, which we'll definitely get into a little bit later. Cool. Couple of other options here. I'm gonna undo the kind of auto sync to clip thing. You have this sort of play slice to end function right here, right? And when you have that enabled, what happens is it'll start at whatever slice point, and then it'll just play through the rest of the audio clip after that, right? Right. So I turn the release up a bit. And you notice that that gets pretty muddy and messy because I'm actually able to play polyphonically, right? So I can play starting from different positions all the way through the clip, right? So to deal with that, you can turn your voicing down to mono if you'd like to. Now it'll only let you play one note at a time and therefore play one slice at a time, right? Or you can also turn that play slice to end off, right? The play single slice option is kind of interesting because now what it'll do is it's only going to play one slice, and it's actually just going to pitch through whichever slice that is, right? Believe what you can do to change which slice is being played is to change the start position of your sample. So basically, that sample kind of start position control now just controls which slice is being played, and then you can play kind of chromatically using just that single slice. So you can basically use this to kind of quickly find like a single hit in your sample, in your like loop, and then you can use it to play that single sample chromatically. Instead of having to go in and just sort of like find the exact start point, find the kind of like end point manually. It just lets you kind of slice it up and then choose, right? And then another thing that you can do here is you can change the root note of that sample when you're in slice mode, right? So you can only change by octaves. So when you're in normal slice mode, it assigns the different MIDI notes of your like MIDI controller or keyboard or your MIDI clip to different samples or different sort of slices of the sample. But in this case, you can pitch the whole thing down by an octave, and now when we're playing it, right? Oh wait, actually. Now, this is not actually doing what I thought it was. So what that actually does is it makes it so that the MIDI note that you're sort of playing, right? For the very first slice, Serum is expecting MIDI note C1, right? And when I switched the root note to C0, it's now expecting that this very first MIDI note be C0, right? So in my setup in the MIDI keyboard right now, the lowest note I can play is that C1, which is gonna be, you can kind of see it actually playing this slice right here first. Right. So the reason why you would use that is if you had a sample that was maybe kind of longer, right? And you wanted to slice it up into a bunch of different slices. Or if you sort of turned your threshold like all the way down on something that had a ton of different sort of transients in it. And you're not necessarily super concerned about a lot of like the very early notes here, right? You mostly want to focus on like this slice and everything after it. Then you can just set that so that now whatever your kind of like lowest note that you're expecting to play is going to be playing that specific like octave, right?
Gotcha.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you modulate or automate the sensitivity for the transients? Because I know you can't do that in simpler. Like you can't. Yeah, it's like a static manual setting.
Doesn't seem like you can.
Do you know why that is in these samplers? Like, is that like a resources kind of thing, or?
I think it must be. Wonder if I can potentially right click on that, or if we can get it in the modulation matrix. So if there's like one of the destination options. So we can change the slice play mode. We can change this to modulate whether or not it's like single slice or not. So a thing that we can do, which is kind of interesting, is we can go and say, have this modulate a single slice, right? And then maybe I'll have the source be like macro 1 or something, right? This isn't really answering your question. I'm pretty sure the reason why you can't normally do this is just because it affects like how like the MIDI notes are kind of getting assigned to like different parts of the sample.
Oh,
Right.
interesting.
Right. So because it's affecting the way the MIDI notes are getting assigned to different parts of the sample, if you kind of modulate that, what winds up happening is it like interferes with like the actual pattern that you're sort of expecting. And it's just something that like I think would be sort of like almost like too chaotic to even like be super musically useful.
Yeah,
I guess
yeah.
is the best way to put it, because like you would be modulating the sensitivity, and then if the sensitivity is all the way up here, you'll notice that C1 is this note, right? And it's gonna play that sample. And it didn't even get the very beginning, right? Then if I go back down a little bit, now that same sound is actually C#1. Playing for it, right? So it actually kind of like changed that, right?
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So, yeah. If I go into single slice mode real quick, I think the macro that I just set up in the matrix, I'll turn this kind of all the way up. Now, this dial is actually letting me scan through which slice I play. Right? So that's another way to modulate that. Instead of modulating kind of the start position, you can use this macro now to control, because in the matrix I have it set up to change which single slice of all of the slices we're playing, as long as we're in this play single slice mode.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a way to give you kind of like a dial of what you're manually choosing between different sounds in like a sliced up sample.
Oh, cool. Okay, that's kind of what I was getting at with the other one, is the sort of break beat kind of chopping and
Totally.
changing. Yeah, yeah. Cool.
Totally, yeah. Yeah. Cool. Cool. We'll do slicing off for a second, just to show another couple of things that you can do with this. You can do some things to the sample directly from this menu. You can create crossfades on kind of the edges of the sample. So if I do that, you'll notice it kind of like fades up and kind of fades down near the end. And if I go ahead and hit this undo button right here, that's going to undo that flow, right? So this undo button and redo button's over here for whatever you want to do. If you decide it wasn't the move, you can do that. You can also normalize samples, so you can kind of adjust the volume so that the highest peak is going to hit basically kind of like 0 dB, right? You can go in here and you can reverse a sample like this if you want to, which can be kind of fun when you're using slice modes, right? Now it's kind of detecting these kind of transients that are kind of backwards. We're also still in single slice mode, so I don't want to do that. Right. So now we can slice it up and play all those slices backwards because the sample itself is reversed, right? And then there's this kind of trim option, right? So if I were to take my kind of start point, that's happening. I undo the reverse real quick, and I make this a little bit longer, or sorry, a little shorter, so we just get the first kind of few slices in there. I believe that if I now go right click and say trim, it's going to crop that sample just to that selection that I made, right, between the start position and the end position. And now that I've done that, what's kind of interesting, it would snap off for a second. You'll notice that I'm able to create a lot more kind of slices potentially because I have sort of like a shorter sample. Or at least initially we had like some of like more slices because it was kind of dividing this shorter sample into all of the different kind of positions, number of slices that it had first. But now I just have this sort of like limited number of slices that I can. So you can really just sort of like isolate kind of the important sounds in a loop that you want to be able to kind of play as slices in here, right? Anybody have any questions about the kind of like slicing modes? Before we kind of move on to our next oscillator type. Okay. So next thing I want to talk about is the granular engine. So once again, granular engine is going to basically be fairly similar to kind of the sampling engine, but instead of sort of playing through a sample kind of like normally, or playing it through in slices, or playing it through kind of like, backward and reverse normally, the granular engine is going to basically play back like a bunch of really, really short loops of their sample, kind of all kind of like stacked on top of each other, and play them back in kind of like interesting ways, right? So I selected this kind of like drone Chronos thing just as an example. And right now, I think I need to go to the matrix, and I need to undo this routing that I did right here. Because it seems like Serum is just like not actually getting. This is odd. Now. There we go. Okay. So the reason why that wasn't working was because slice mode was on, right? And the granular engine can also use kind of slices, but you have to actually set your slices up kind of correctly. So I'm gonna have slice mode off for this just to show the actual functions of kind of the granular engine itself. So the main controls that we have for kind of granular synthesizer are this sort of grain density control and this kind of grain length control, right? So the grain density is the total number of grains, which are essentially the total number of loops that kind of like stack and kind of play at the same time as each other, right? So if I turn the total number of grains up, you'll notice that we get kind of significant timbre changes there, right? I'll turn the number of grains kind of down. The length is the length of each of those grains in milliseconds, right? So if I turn the length of these grains up, now each grain is like 3.5 seconds long. And so as I increase the density, we're just going to get a lot more kind of like stacks on top of each other. Right. Wait a second. I get a little more release on the main envelope. Right. If you take this grain length and you turn it down pretty significantly, you can start affecting the actual kind of pitch of like the playback of the granular engine, right? Because what's happening is the length of your grains now at like 160 milliseconds or so might actually be what kind of like a single cycle of these grains kind of the waveform of this sample actually kind of is, right? So at these kind of like lower millisecond values, you might actually be sort of changing like the actual kind of pitch of like what a single cycle might look like basically in these grains. Right? So interestingly enough, when you turn the grain density down to 0 grains, you basically just get kind of one of them playing at once. And you can change the length of the grains to kind of have them be this like really sort of like almost like sort of like very rough, like the loop kind of happens very, very quickly and it like doesn't always kind of like happen constantly, right? Sort of effect. And then as you increase the density, you wind up with sort of like a smoother kind of sound, basically. It sort of like settles to. Right. Now you'll notice I'm playing a bunch of different notes on the keyboard, and we're not really hearing kind of like a difference in pitch that much, right? And that is because I have set that length to like really, really, really short. And it's also scanning through the waveform, right? So if I set this length to a bit longer, what winds up happening is you get this interaction between the fact that you're playing through this sample at different speeds, because whenever you play a different MIDI note on the keyboard, it plays through the sample itself at a different kind of pitch, right? And what that really means is that your grains are scanning through the sample at different speeds, right? So this sort of cluster of, say, maybe 5 grains at a time that are all playing back at a length of sort of 44 milliseconds. So like the grains themselves are sort of a 44 millisecond chunk of the sample, right? But that chunk of the sample is kind of moving through the sample constantly, right? All of those things are affecting the pitch of the sound in different ways. And because they're all affecting the pitch of the sound in different ways, they wind up interfering with each other in a lot of ways and making it so that when you're playing different notes on the keyboard, you actually just get this kind of atonal mess, essentially. That I just played a major scale on the keyboard and it sounded nothing like a major scale, right? So that's something that you really have to be careful with in granular synthesis, is that
Yeah.
oftentimes you'll kind of be playing some stuff, right? I'm gonna go back to something that's maybe a little bit more kind of like a standard sound. Let's get like just kind of like a long vibrato flute or something like that, right? And see if that sounds a little bit better. Right? Still really didn't sound quite right, although we were able to pick out more and more like sort of more musical tones from that sample. So the thing that you kind of want to really be thinking about is if your grain length is long enough, it doesn't wind up kind of interfering with the actual pitch of the sound too much, right? So if you turn the grain length up to maybe 400 milliseconds, now we're able to get more kind of like a actual pitches playing the sort of major scale there, right? Similar thing for density. As you add more and more grains on top of each other, what they might start doing is because they're all playing kind of at the same time, but just like slightly offset from each other, right? And that's really why granular synthesis kind of sounds the way it does, is because all of these grains, as you increase the grain density, they're not playing back like exactly the same. That would just be kind of like a loop that was just sort of like additive. They're playing back just a little bit offset in time from each other, right? And because they're playing back a little bit offset in time from each other, as you keep turning them up, they keep having more and more opportunities to phase interfere with each other, essentially, right? Which is why some of these notes are super quiet at a really high grain density, and some of them are a little louder. So again, you can kind of solve for that by increasing the grain length again. Then you get this almost kind of like stretched out kind of sound, right? Or you can kind of turn the grain density down again. And at that point, it kind of mostly just sounds like we're playing back through the sample, mostly normally. Okay. So where things get a little bit more interesting is when we change the scan rate, right? So if I go down to maybe like a 10% scan rate, now we're playing through the sample at maybe kind of like 10% of the speed. I'm gonna change that actually to like 25. So it's sort of like a quarter of the speed, and therefore maybe like, so sample would be playing back 2 octaves down. Doesn't actually sound like it's playing back 2 octaves down though, right? So what's going on there, the reason why it doesn't actually sound like it's being pitched, is because when you're using a granular synthesizer, the scan rate does not control the actual playback speed of the grains through the sample. The playback speed of the grains through the sample is always going to be controlled by what note you're hitting on the MIDI, right? Or what note you're sending it via MIDI from your DAW. what the scan control does is it's basically making it so that the start position of each of those new grains that are coming in is going to start more and more offset in the sample itself, right? So you can actually see this happening if I play this kind of lower note. We're seeing the start positions sort of slowly scan through the sample, and then these individual white lines are actually the grains playing through kind of normally, right?
Oh, visual, yeah.
Yeah, actually works really well. And if I change the length of the grains now, so even though it kind of looks like it's moving through that sort of faster, what's actually going on is that because each sort of like grain length is shorter, it sort of like covers a shorter period of time. It actually just means that sort of the grains are kind of like coming and going sort of a little bit faster, right? Because the other way to kind of think about how a granular synthesizer works is each grain has kind of a volume envelope to it, right? And those volume envelopes are able to control it through this menu. And you can kind of change the amount here, right? And if we turn the amount all the way down to 0, you'll notice that we get this like really clicky and broken up sound, right? So this kind of volume envelope of these grains is sort of designed to make it so that as it's playing through the grain, which is just essentially, you can think of it as like a small slice of the sample, right? It starts at this low volume and then sort of fades up. And then once it gets to the end of the length of the grain, right, which is controlled by this dial right here, then it sort of fades down. So you can think of this actual length of this volume envelope that we're looking at as being the same length as this grain length control right here. So it's total of 300-ish milliseconds to go all the way up to maximum and then go all the way kind of down to minimum volume, right? And then the sort of density control is how many of those grains are kind of playing back like sort of like layered on top of each other, but like maybe like I don't think this is actually measured in seconds necessarily, like 5 or 6 grains a second, but basically saying that a total of maybe like 6 grains can technically be playing at the same time as each other, right? That's kind of the best way to put it. Right. And so if I reduce that grain length, because the length itself is sort of like such a short amount of time, we're only at 36 millisecond chunk of the sample, right? Rather than like a 300 millisecond chunk of the sample. We sort of have a greater kind of like perceived density of grains because those grains are coming and going much, much faster. If that makes sense, right? But we also get closer and closer to being more kind of like atonal, I would say, right? So I'll turn the length up again. I'm going to turn the density up again. Turn it down a bit for the purposes of this. And so we have a couple of controls that we can change for this kind of like grain envelope shape. There's a bunch of preset shapes that we can choose. There's the sort of like Han one. They all have these sort of like different names, right? So Welch is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a little bit more of just like kind of like a purely logarithmic curve. Gaussian, you can see is more of just like a spike in the middle, right? And you can actually hear, we're just hearing kind of like little blips of each of the individual grains as they're playing, right? So if I change the grain length now. A lot more obvious what the effect of the grain lag actually is. Right. Each individual grain just like takes a shorter amount of time or a longer amount of time, right? Versus the density. They're all taking up the same amount of time per grain, but there's more grains, and therefore there's more grains layered on top of each other, slightly offset in time from each other, so it has the effect of sounding like smoother, right?
I think you like modulate both to get like some cool like ping pong like
Yes.
effects.
Oh yeah, yeah, you can do that. Yeah, so
Really cool.
other thing that you can do with this is there's like a skew control, so you can kind of skew the center of each of these envelopes, right? So if I skew this to the length, to the depth down. You kind of hear that sort of becomes like almost sort of like a time modulation thing, right? And sort of as you're changing the skew, it sort of slows down or kind of speeds up grains, right? There's also kind of like a randomness control in here for the skew and a randomness control for the amount. Right? So if you randomize the skew a bunch, you can have those kind of like ladder sort of skew positions be kind of in a random space. Adding randomness to this one in the skews specifically sounds kind of, it has like the biggest effect, I would say, right? Because this shape is so focused on like one little blip for the envelope shape versus another one. Like this is a little bit more of kind of like a smooth envelope shape. So like Harris one. There's also this sync. There's the 2 key. You can have this just be kind of like a triangle envelope. And if you skew this, you get sort of like a downward like ramp envelope shape or an upward ramp envelope shape, right? Or there's kind of a trapezoidal one. But you notice the skew control is now gone on the trapezoidal one. And this amount kind of changes it between more of just like kind of like a square, like gate, like on and off, versus just having a little bit of ramp up time and then it just sort of stays loud, right? Then there's this kind of exponential decay, which for the amount you can change the sort of like curvature of that exponential decay. Or there's this reversed exponential decay. Right. So those are all the sort of envelope shapes that you can control, again, for the individual. Choose this 2 key one. Like basically like the volume envelope shapes for each of the individual grains, right? Which is different from say like an envelope shape for your sound itself. So I'm still controlling the sort of envelope shape for the full sound with my volume envelope generator right here. So another interesting thing about the granular engine I really like is the fact that for each of these controls, including an offset for the start position is one of them, but for sort of the scan speed, for the kind of individual kind of pitch, right here for the kind of grain length and for the kind of panning, you have like a randomness amount dial, right? So I can turn up this random amount dial for start position for the offset. And now these grains are still scanning, but sometimes they're starting before the start of the scan point, and then sometimes they're starting like after the beginning of the scan, right? You can also randomize the direction. Now, sometimes some of them are going to scan backwards, sometimes some of them are going to scan forwards, right? We can randomize their pitch, which creates this like really kind of creepy pseudo detune, right? You can also randomize the length of each grain. But now some of the grains are going to be shorter, some are going to be longer. Right. And then you can randomize kind of like the panning of each grain too. Okay. And that gives you a really interesting like quiet stereo effect. I could also take my initial kind of like scan rate and I could bring it into negative. So maybe we could go really slow, like a negative, like kind of 11% or something like that. And what you'll notice is now it's going to start from the very end of the sample. And it's going to kind of scan backwards through it. Because the end of the sample has kind of a long tail that fades down to 0. You wind up getting this really, really long kind of attack, right? So that's one of the kind of like use cases, I think, for granular synthesis is sort of taking like a sample that's maybe kind of like a longer sample that changes a lot over time and sort of like almost like stretching it out in a way where you're sort of like playing like the sort of same pitch, but you're stretching out the changes in timbre a lot over time. Like you're sort of like smoothing out that sample and making it so normally if you were to play it back at 10% speed, it would kind of pitch down. But in the granular case, if you're playing it back at 10% speed, the grains themselves are playing that normal speed, but there's just a bunch of them kind of playing top of each other, right? So if I go up to this kind of like maybe 10% scan here, change my grain density to be a little bit more, right? Have this much more kind of like stretched out, kind of like flute sound, right?
Yeah.
Just as kind of another quick example of another sort of use case of this. I go to like a non-tonal thing and I go to maybe kind of like a drum sound, like let's get like a kick or something, right? We'll do kind of like an 808 kick, like A03 or something, right? We go ahead and turn the octave of this up a bit. Change my grain length, and my scan rate to like 0. Change this to like a slightly more kind of tonal drum sound. Maybe I'll do like a clap or something. Right. With that, I can kind of like really sort of like stretch out and kind of extend that clap sound, right? With this sort of like grain density. So it's a way to kind of like take samples and get these like really kind of like super different kind of like timbres and kind of tones out of them by just like taking all of these sort of separate, small, tiny little loops and kind of stacking them together in these interesting ways. Right. Times it. Good time. So I do want to get into the warp section here. For the granular synthesis engine, again, we just have the exact same types of kind of warping that we can do as, say, like the sample engine. So we've got the different cross modulation options, and we've got distortion options here, and we've got kind of filter options, which can be fun to play around with. They're not necessarily super kind of different from what we just did with kind of what sampler engine itself. And I know that was kind of like a cursory kind of intro to kind of like granular synthesis. But I just wanted to kind of go through a lot of the sort of like different features that are in Serum here, because I do want to move on to the spectral engine if we feel ready for that. Unless anybody has any other questions about kind of the granular engine before we move on.
I just had a quick question about, it sounded like something that can happen a lot with the granular synthesis is kind of like buildup of resonances.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so is that something that you would kind of take care of with EQ or like
honestly, you could take care of it with EQ. You could also potentially take care of it kind of with sort of like the settings of the granular engine itself. Potentially, like a lot of those buildups come from having really, really short grain lengths plus really, really large, like big density values, right? So if I go to this kind of like trombone thing, and my grain density is like 1, scan rate is like really, really slow, but the length is like semi-reasonable. I would say at like 200 milliseconds, and I play some notes. Right? Not too many buildups of resonance there, but if we turn the density up, right?
yeah, gotcha.
You can kind of fix it by changing your grain length, or you can fix it by changing the density of it. Right? Those are kind of the main ways of doing it.
Okay, sweet. Thanks.
Okay. So let's go to the spectral synthesis engine, right? And you'll notice that when we switched over to the spectral synthesis engine, the loadout of our waveform changed pretty drastically, right? We're not looking at kind of like a 2D, like just like sort of audio waveform view anymore. We're actually looking at what's called a spectrogram of our sound, right? So now if I go ahead and play through there, we've kind of got a very, very similar thing happening to the granular engine, where the scan playthrough rate doesn't actually affect the pitch of the sound anymore. So if I switch this back to scan 100%, it's kind of loud. Turn this down just a touch. You go back to the original octave. We're just playing back through this kind of trombone sample normally. You'll notice it sounds a little bit weird compared to just the regular sample, right? So if I switch back to sample mode and I play this, we're playing back scan rate of 100%. Switch back to that, go back to spectral. You can kind of hear it feels like overall a bit louder, right? And it also feels like the transients of the sounds have kind of been smeared a little bit, right? So the spectral synthesis engine is able to separate pitch from time, right? Using kind of like a fast Fourier transform math on our sounds. And because it's able to separate pitch from time, I can take my scan rate and I can turn it down to like something kind of random, like maybe like 57%. And now I was able to just slow down the sample without changing the pitch, right? So if I'm playing, say, like C3 at a scan rate of 57%, same pitches at a scan rate of 100%, or exactly the same as a scan rate of negative 40%, but it plays backwards. Right. I'll go to like maybe a scan rate of like 20%. So already you're able to do the kind of like, almost kind of like warping and Ableton, where you're able to separate pitch from time and kind of change the length of your samples that you're putting through here without changing their pitch. Also got a couple of kind of right here, this filter that you can sort of like create here. This filter is really interesting because it's based on one of these sort of like grid controls, right? But what you're really looking at is you're looking at kind of like a parametric EQ in a way, right? So this is sort of like a filter shape that you're kind of creating. You can think of the left as sort of the lower frequencies of the spectrum. The right is kind of the higher frequencies of the spectrum, right? This cutoff dial is going to take this filter shape that you've created, and it's going to sort of move it up and down across the frequency spectrum, as we can kind of see, right? So if I play this, apologies for this because I'm probably creating some clipping, so I'm going to go ahead and add a limiter to the main track if I can. 1 second. Now, that's one thing that you really want to watch out for with the Spectral engine in Serum 2 is that it is very, very easy to end up with like, you know, resonances that are like super loud, kind of clip a lot, right? So if I turn the mix down on this filter, it's just sort of like reducing the overall kind of peaks and valleys of this filter shape. But I'm basically able to use that as like kind of like a, you know, additional kind of like weirdly custom shaped filter, basically, right? It has this like kind of odd shape that I was able to kind of just draw in here and sort of change on my own and add however many kind of like breakpoints I want and make some of these kind of curved, right? And then sort of move it across the spectrum. Right. So that's kind of the other kind of main control for kind of the spectral engine is this sort of like spectral filtering that you can do to it, where you're basically, the way the spectral engine really works is it's taking the sound from the sample you've imported, right? And it's dividing that sound up into a bunch of sort of individual kind of like frequency bands. Like they call it sort of like harmonics essentially, right? It's like finding a bunch of different harmonics. And the way that it's able to kind of separate pitch from time is it's able to basically sort of treat all of those kind of harmonic sort of volumes separately from each other, right? So each of those is being kind of played back as if it were sort of like an oscillator almost, that particular harmonic, right? That's why you're able to sort of like create this sort of like interesting custom filter shape. Turn the mix down on that for now. And then the other thing that you can do with the spectral engine is we have a bunch of spectral warp modes here that we can kind of go through, right? I'm gonna go ahead and maybe change this sample. Let's get like, sure, we'll try this like horsehead fiddle because this one's gonna be kind of like a longer sound. Go ahead and close the kind of filter window. Rates it, go through that. And then let's try some of these kind of spectral options, right? So we got this detune plus and minus. I'm gonna set this to 50%, which should theoretically be kind of 0. doing with that kind of detune plus and minus. And you'll notice that there's kind of like two controls here. There's this sort of lower kind of like warp variation, and there's this kind of warp control right here. Is we're able to take a bunch of these kind of like spectrum that are kind of like below the original and kind of move them around. And also kind of the individual harmonics that are sort of like above kind of like a threshold point, essentially, right? To be able to take those and either shift them up in pitch or shift them down in pitch separately from all of the other harmonics that are below a certain cutoff frequency. That makes sense, right? So we're actually able to kind of separate those harmonics out from each other. There's also this kind of smear that we can do. And this sort of has the effect of both making the sample kind of quieter and also kind of like noisier, right? So what it's doing is it's taking these kind of harmonics and it's reducing their volume and also applying kind of like a randomness to them too, right? And then we have this secondary control. Which mostly does kind of like the volume fading part by itself of kind of the smear control, right? There's this spread plus and minus, which will either take all of the kind of individual harmonics and either squeeze them together around a center point or spread them away from each other around that center point, right? And then that's actually kind of fun. You've got also these two kind of controls here, which are essentially the kind of like cutoff positions of the sort of like lowest kind of minimum threshold for harmonics and like the highest maximum kind of threshold for certain harmonics, right? So you can kind of constrain all of the harmonics in the sound to a certain kind of like frequency band with those. And that way you avoid getting these like, you know, below human hearing level things or kind of like even beyond kind of human hearing level things, right? So now that spreading, it really sounds like almost like alien, but that spreading is basically being constrained to this sort of like frequency band, right? Because when we're looking at this kind of like spectrogram, we can think of, I'm just going to turn this off for a second. We can think of like lower pitches being kind of like the sort of the lower end of this, and then higher pitches being kind of like the higher, like top part. That kind of like spectrum, right? We've got this harmonics, which is basically going to figure out kind of what the fundamental of this is, and then just sort of like increase the volume of all of the higher harmonics in here. Makes this really kind of bright, almost like sound, right? And then again, we can kind of constrain how high those harmonics get up to. We've got a subharmonic generator. Which that kind of can get a little bit out of control really quickly, but basically it's going to sort of like take what it sees as kind of the harmonic series or like the different harmonics in this, and it's going to just add in harmonics kind of below that fundamental, right? That kind of match. The tonality of it. This gate one is interesting because what the gate does is it essentially analyzes the volume of all of the individual kind of harmonics, and then it says, okay, like the harmonic is only going to be present if it's louder than a particular kind of like set volume, right? So as I kind of turn this up, it has the effect of reducing the overall number of kind of harmonics that we hear, because some of the harmonics, either the lower ones or the higher ones, basically the ones that are not quite as loud, they're just going to get muted, right? And so as we keep turning this up, we kind of just get closer and closer to a sine wave. Because eventually we're only able to sort of hear the kind of fundamental frequency, because that's usually the loudest frequency, right? Robotize is a very fun and interesting one. So, a little bit difficult to see what's going on here, but as you turn this up, it's kind of applying kind of like a volume like automation to each of these individual harmonics, and kind of applying like a tremolo effect to them. Right. Then as you turn it up past kind of 50%, it kind of smears that tremolo out, but kind of almost sort of like makes it so fast that it's kind of applying kind of like a modulation to the sound, right? Also got shift, which is kind of an interesting one. So you can kind of think of that as like a frequency shifter almost, right? So it's taking each of these individual harmonics and it's sort of shifting them kind of up or down, but in a way where it's not really caring about like the root note. It's not really caring about kind of like, it's not the same thing as just taking a sample and kind of like pitching it up or down. It's taking each of the individual harmonics and like shifting them in a linear fashion, right? So if this harmonic is at maybe like 500 hertz and we turn the shift up a bit, that harmonic is going to get shifted up to maybe like 600 hertz, right? But if one of these upper harmonics was at like 2000 hertz, if you were to shift it up in a way that like actually matches the perceived pitch, that sort of shift would go from like 2000 hertz to like maybe like 2500 or like 2600 hertz or something, to sort of like scale with the same amount of shift. But in this case, it's only shifting by 100 hertz from 2000 hertz, right? So that's why it sounds more and more atonal as you continue shifting. Right. Now, mirror is one that can also get really dangerous, because what happens is, right, you are starting to add individual sort of more harmonics as like a mirror image, starting from like the very, very like brightest harmonics that can possibly be added in this engine, right? So sometimes it's best to kind of match this with kind of a filter, or sometimes it's best to kind of constrain. That, right? And then if you go kind of loud enough with that mirror, you can see that those harmonics start to kind of almost cancel each other out, right? Sort of interesting. The peak follow is also an interesting one. It's kind of, as we can kind of see when we selected it, just like cutting away a bunch of the very, very highest harmonics in general. And it might actually sound a lot more kind of interesting on something that's a little bit more rhythmic. So if we go to maybe like a percussion loop or something, it's like an island conga thing. I'm gonna set the scan rate to like 100%. So the peak follow really is sort of only letting through kind of like the loudest harmonics, but it's kind of like following the envelope shape of those harmonics too. And then kind of constraining that to essentially just down to root notes. So you can kind of turn that sort of like little conga loop into almost like a melody that way. And then of course there's this sort of peak plus octave above. Just doing kind of a similar peak follow thing, but as you turn it up, it sort of shifts the whole kind of frequencies, sort of like spectrum up an octave essentially, right?
Mhm.
Kind of blends those through. And then we've got a similar thing, but octave negative. It's sort of doing the opposite of that, right? And then there's the sort of peak kind of harmonics, which shifts between kind of plus and minus octaves. I'm turn the scan rate down on this a bit. It'll be interesting. Right. Change this to something a little bit more. Let's get just like a trombone for now. Right. So what's really going on is when you go between 0 and halfway, kind of adding a bunch of higher harmonics. And then when you go between halfway and full, it's like cutting away a lot of the lower harmonics there too, right? Same thing for this negative 12. Sort of adding a bunch of kind of subharmonics, right? But they're at the same kind of like pitch, right? So kind of an interesting one. And there's this harmonic sweep. Which just kind of takes some of the higher harmonics and then it just sort of like sweeps them kind of up and down separately from the rest of the sound. Right. And then shepherd tone generator. So this is going to be a really interesting one, especially if we were to say, maybe grab a different sample. Yeah, we'll do this like DX7 kind of ensemble thing, right? And then I'm going to take my really slow LFO. I'm going to apply that to this sort of shepherd tone generating thing, and then I'm going to make this kind of a constant ramp up. So what it's doing is it's basically subtracting kind of individual harmonics from the original sound to sort of create like shepherd tones, right? Which, if you all know what shepherd tones are, they're basically that kind of like barbershop pole illusion sound, where it always sounds like it's kind of constantly increasing in pitch or kind of constantly decreasing in pitch, but it's never actually really moving anywhere, right?
Oh.
Yeah.
Huh.
That's an interesting one. Go ahead and remove the modulator. Gotcha, yeah.
Yeah, sure, man. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
So
good weekend, man.
cool. Yeah. go a little bit late today because I do want to get through most of these. We've gone through like a few of them. There's this kind of comb filter. It basically kind of adds this sort of like comb filter on top, and then you can, I think, maybe either adjust the resonance of that comb filter with the sort of secondary modulation. There's this pitch blend one. Which just shifts the harmonics around like a ton. And then the secondary thing kind of adds some of the upper harmonics back. Right. And we can hear a lot of these tend to get like kind of ridiculously bright. There's also this pitch shift one, where if we go to exactly 50%, we kind of should be. I think this is sort of like kind of a blend control, or kind of like a dry wet almost for that. Right. The phase twist is a wonky one. We can kind of hear it sort of adding kind of like a phaser effect as we're sort of modulating back and forth. I have to assume that it's sort of like adjusting the phases of each individual kind of harmonic, right? Then there's sort of like a formant shift. Which would probably sound better on a slightly different sample. So let's go to something maybe like bassy or something like that. We'll do something like this. Interesting kind of vowel lead sounds you can get out of that. Then there are these mask ones, right? And then there's these kind of like vocoder ones. So what you'll notice about these is that these are actually cross modulations between this granular synthesis, or sorry, this spectral synthesis engine and one of the other noise sources, like say, you can take a mask from B, or you can take a mask from C, or you can take a mask from the noise generator or the sub generator or the two filters. So if we try to say like a mask from B, right? Turn the octave on that. Turn oscillator B back on again. Maybe make this. I'll have this loop. Start turning up the mask now. You can almost get this like pseudo sidechaining effect. Because what's going on is the individual kind of like spectrum, individual harmonics are getting kind of like masked away. They're getting kind of like ducked by this sound, essentially, right? So if I were to change this from a sample, oops, maybe to a wavetable, and then go back to kind of like the standard thing, play some notes here. That mask is going to kind of remove all of the kind of like harmonics that are part of this sort of sawtooth wave from this sample that I've got right here, right? Or to change that to maybe a square wave, so we only have odd harmonics. We can hear that now we're only kind of left with the even harmonics of this sample, right? And then vocoding is kind of a similar thing. But what's basically going on is it's kind of working like sort of more of a traditional vocoder, where this is kind of our carrier wave, and then whatever is in oscillator B is going to be our modulator wave, I believe, right? So if I change this to sample mode, then, and maybe choose like a loop or something like this. Now, we can hear that this kind of spectral sample kind of being vocoded to this, right? I choose something that's maybe a little bit more right, like say one of these kind of like longer flute vibrato things. You kind of hear it's sort of like a vocoder effect happening, right? Tough that, right? Okay. Does anybody have any kind of questions about that kind of like spectral synthesis engine? I know that was sort of like kind of a cursory kind of glance almost at just like what the different things that you can do with sort of spectral synthesis are. But I hope it at least kind of like made sense as to like how spectral synthesis really works, especially in Serum 2.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Cool. Nice. Awesome.
Yeah, I definitely have a better idea of how to use it.
Totally. Nice. Nice. That's good.
I did have a quick question, which would be,
Yes.
could you use Spectral as like the FM oscillator on another sample? Like,
Yeah, you totally could.
yeah.
Let's go ahead and change this to, we'll go sample. Let's go to maybe like a regular thing, like a bode, like doubled vibrato thing. And then let's actually listen to this. We won't listen to this. We will maybe do like a kind of like interesting kind of like harmonics thing there. And then we'll go, let's try maybe like amplitude modulation from A, right? And now when I play, getting amplitude modulation from that. And as I change this kind of harmonic shift, really kind of making that amplitude modulation get like even crazier, right?
Oh, that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah. We could also do like maybe phase distortion from A. There's already a lot, right? But then maybe if we do this sort of subharmonics warp mode on here. You just get to that like kind of crazy noisy place, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But I could see that doing some cool things since like the harmonic info in the spectral is so rich. You can do stuff.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Cool. Yeah.
Nice. All right. Well, thanks for coming to this one, y'all.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank
And
you.
then next time we're going to get more into the actual kind of like modulation section. And we're going to really talk about the envelopes. We're going to talk about the LFOs, a little bit about the macros, a little bit about the other stuff, which is like the velocity and kind of like note stuff down here. So, and also the matrix view is a big factor of that too.
Awesome.
Sweet. All right.
All right, thanks, Quinn. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Absolutely. Thank you.